Greetings everybody and welcome back. This is the Digital Portrait Drawing course. We are now on lesson 6 where we will be demonstrating how to draw eyes in Photoshop and bring our portrait to a much more finished state. Okay, so let's go ahead and pick up where we left off on the last session. Now I did have a couple other layers in here for the eye shading and the hair shading just to finish off that session, but I've removed those for this because we're going to start to bring this portrait into a much more finished type of appearance, and we're going to start with the eyes. Alright, before we do that, let's go ahead and grab a reference. I've got my reference photo here. I'm just going to create a selection around that. Hit Control or Command C to copy. Come back over here and paste that right in and just have it just off to the side so we can see it and use it as a reference while we're drawing. Alright, so let's go ahead and add a new layer for the basic eye. This is just going to be the beginning of her right eye. It's our left, so I'm going to refer to it as the left eye, even though it's her right because it's to my left side. We've got our Titan layer here that is looking pretty strong, so I'm going to pull that down a little bit in opacity just to sort of fade it back a little bit. Grab my brush tool and begin on a new layer for the left eye and start with the HB pencil. Resume adding the outlines of it. I want to capture just the major lines of the eye in this sense, because this is a very sharp, very dark pencil. It leaves a good crisp mark, and I like that, and I'm going to use that to the advantage because I'm just going to outline the major tenets of the eye. I want to grab the major shape, make sure we get the round iris and the pupil in there. Now if you're struggling to get the roundness of that iris or the pupil, sometimes it's helpful to go ahead and grab the ellipse tool, set it to path, and just create a perfect circle by holding down the shift key, move it in where you want it. Sometimes that's helpful just to have as a guide so you can see where the circle should be and go that way. But I'm not going to use that right now. I just wanted to be able to show that to you as an available tool. Now as you're drawing out these details, there's a couple things to be aware of. Always make sure that you capture the tear duct over on the inside corner of the eye. That's this little rounded corner that has a sort of a juicy area just inside there. And as the eye comes up and along, the longest lashes are found from the top of the eye towards the outside of the eye. That's also where they're the thickest. And watch the direction that they go in. As you notice that the top ones, if they're really long, they start going down and then they curve upwards. So when you're doing that, start it out down and up and use the pressure sensitivity of the brush to capture the fade in thickness as it goes out. So it's a nice thin pointed tip at the edge, but it's a little bit thicker at the base. And then the iris itself is not totally visible, usually. Sometimes in times of fear or shock or surprise, you'll see all of the iris, the white's completely around the eyes, but in most cases it's not. Always be sure to grab this inner little shelf here. There's this little wedge of flesh that's the thickness of the skin that's between where the eye actually meets the skin and where the lower lashes begin to grow. And that's always going to be a lighter color than the skin that's directly below it. Even though the skin does tend to catch the highlight, the natural coloring will be lighter here. Okay, now while you're detailing the eye, if you're finding that the default coloring of the HB pencil is a little too light, go ahead and switch it over to the black, because that'll create a really nice sharp line. You want to make sure you catch this crease that's up over the eye too. This should appear to be behind the lashes, but it is just as dark, and it will create one of the most visual shading elements of the eye. So let's look at the darkness of the pupil in our reference file here. Now, Instinctively, you'll probably want to just generate this as a solid black, and that's actually a good way to begin. But notice that the top of the pupil, aside from the highlight, is actually darker than the bottom area. That's because it's on shadow underneath this top eyelid. The entire eye is shaded that way. The lightest portion of it is going to be at the bottom where the light hits it more, other than the highlight. The highlight's always going to be the brightest spot, but as far as shading is concerned, the top is darker because it's being shadowed by the eyelid. So let's go ahead and create an eye shading layer. I'm going to move it underneath the detail layer that we have, just because I prefer it that way. And I'm going to grab my 2B pencil and I'm going to set it to black. Alright, now I will go in there and use this nice dark black pencil to just completely color in that entire pupil area. Okay, so that's nice and dark, very, very black. So how do we deal with the shading that I just talked about? Well, what we're going to use is the eraser tool. Now, I've got the brush of the eraser set to a large, soft brush. So it's over 200 pixels large with the hardness of 0. See, and then I'm going to pull the opacity down to about 40, and I'm just going to touch. Light touches, and that creates that shading that we were talking about. Now for the highlight, I'm going to use the chiseled eraser, or eraser chiseled, that's in the tool presets for this. And I will actually reduce the size of that tip just a little bit. Look at the position of the highlight in the reference. So let's go ahead and just go in and do that. Now what the highlight does is gives that nice gleam element to it, because that's what makes the eye appear wet, is if there's a nice sharp highlight. Also notice in the reference that there's a reflection of the lashes that you can see in the highlight. So let's grab our brush tool again. That looks really, really sharp. So I'm going to grab my HB pencil and set it to a solid black and just draw those in. Okay, so now it's time to shade in some more of that. I'm keeping the eye shading layer active. I'm going to grab my 2B pencil again, and I'm going to reduce the opacity to about 40%. Alright, and then I'm going to go in and begin doing some of the shading in this. Now, to capture the roundness of the eye, the actual eyeball there, the outside of the whites is shaded darker than the insides. And we also have, like I discussed, that shadow along the top. So nice and lightly shading that outside area there. If you find the pencil isn't shading lightly enough for you, go ahead and reduce that opacity down even further until you can get a good control of the mark. Right, the iris itself does have some shading. We'll talk more about that in just a second. But notice that it's darker near the top, underneath that shadow. We get a good rim to the shading, and also generally the iris will be brighter opposite the main highlight, because that's the way the light sort of falls in. It sort of scatters through the lens and creates more light over on this other side. In this case, with our main highlight being right here, the left side will be a little bit darker, the right side will be a little bit lighter. But there's more shading to come on the iris in just a minute. Let's go ahead and worry about some of the other shading of the rest of the eye too, because we want to make sure it's nice and dark over on this side where it's underneath that shelf of the lid, of the external eyelid. And then generally you're just shading in like we discussed before, creating form and shape by using the shade of the pencil. Okay, next let's talk about creating more detail on the iris. Now the way an iris works, it's hard to even see in our reference file, but if you look closely at somebody's eye, you'll see a lot of very thin, radiating, colored lines emanating from the center of the iris. And these all start in the center and work their way out. They almost look like little hair lines. And to capture that, we will use the HB pencil. And you can either create a new layer for the iris line shading, or you can just do it right on the eyes shading layer. We'll zoom in and just quick strokes out. Nice and thin, nice and sharp, not too overly dark, especially down in the bottom area. Okay, also I want to point out that this lower edge of the eye, sort of the inside edge, just to the side of the tear duct pocket, is barely rendered, as in it's just sort of indicated with the lines of the drawing. It's almost invisible. I know that sounds odd, but if you draw that too heavily, if you use something other than really faint light lines, it does tend to look strange. That's sort of the disappearing lines of the eye, that as long as you leave that faint, things look a lot better. If you close it in entirely, it gets a little odd looking. And it just is one of those things that if you draw it in, it looks a little off and you're not really certain why. If you get to that, try just even erasing the lines that are forming this edge of the eye, and you'll see the realism tends to pop out a little more than if it's completely rendered in. Okay, at this point, let's turn our attention to the eyebrow. So, as usual, I'm going to create a new layer because I'm layer crazy with that, and I'm going to use the 4B pencil to generate the eyebrow. And before we begin, let's take a look at how the eyebrow is formed over here in the reference file. Now, the thickest part is directly over where the iris is. Now, it doesn't move, the iris just happens to be directly underneath the thickest part of the eyebrow, which is over the top of the eye. You'll notice that the shape of the eyebrow generally points in towards the bridge of the nose, so you'll find a curve there. And of course, that's on the inside part. It curves up over the eye. And now she has sort of a double curve to her eyebrow here, which is common, but it's not always there. Sometimes you'll get just a standard arch, but it is comprised, obviously, of just individual hairs. And the best way to render this is to do just that. I know it sounds crazy, and we're not going to do that for the real hair area because this course would take forever. But in the eyebrow, there's really not as many as you think there is. And it's best to try to go ahead and just generate these hairs. It's thickest here. Notice it thins out over along the edges, but pay attention to the direction of the hair growth. On the inside, the hair root is in towards the nose and they grow out. And that continues down along until it starts to switch direction on the left third. Where on the outside the root is still towards the center, but the direction of the hair is facing out. So try to mimic that direction as you're creating these hairs. You don't want them to cross too much. You want them to be, for the most part, parallel, but you will get some overlap, and that's fine. Okay, so that's looking pretty good like that. I believe we're just about done with this. Let's take a step back. At this point, we can go ahead and throw away the reference file or the reference layer. Now here's another trick to sort of deepen the contrast of it, because I find my mark making tends to be a little bit on the light side. So I like to try to compensate for that on the digital portion of it. And that's the great thing about drawing in Photoshop, is that you have these options. You don't have to worry about changing the way you make the mark so much as you do just how to compensate for it on this side. So I'm going to go ahead and group all these eye layers together and call this the left eye. It's the left eye group. And now I'm going to create a merged layer from that by holding Control, Alt, E, or Command Option E on the Mac. And that creates a merged eye group. And look how much deeper that makes things look. Pretty cool, right? All right, now I'm going to copy that merged layer by holding down the Alt or the Option key and dragging it down beneath the group. All right, and now I'm going to use the blur on this one. So Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. I'm going to set this to about 8 pixels. Creates a nice soft look on that there, but it is a little bit too strong, so I'm going to reduce the opacity down to 50. Creates a nice shaded look, but it is obscuring some of the details of that pupil and the iris, and I want those to be nice, just as sharp as they can be. So on this blur layer, and I'll just call that too, blur layer, I'm just going to select around that iris part and delete it. Cancel that, and now we've got a really nice looking eye there. Now, for the almost magical looking part, let's do the exact same thing for the right eye. Nice work, good job, that was fast. Anyway, the thing to notice on the right eye, it is mostly in shadow because of the way the light is falling. Remember how we discussed the light source as we were talking about the shading for the entire face? The eye follows suit with that, but there will still be nice wet reflections in there, but the general tone of the eye socket is darker because there's not as much light falling in. And in this case, we didn't need to worry much about this far edge because it's going to be concealed by hair, but you want to make sure you draw enough of it over. There's a good background to the hair elements that we will worry about in a later lesson. Alright guys, that's it for lesson 6. We've got a couple of really good eyes on that portrait and a great start. So be sure to join me next time where we will explain how to draw the nose.